In 1600s, Europe, all it took to be burned alive was a bad harvest, a grumpy neighbour, and owning a cat. This is the true story of how fear turned ordinary women into witches and why no one was ever truly safe. It was the kind of village that didn't show up on maps and didn't want to, tucked into a crooked forest where the trees leaned just a little too far in and the fog rolled in like it had a schedule to keep. In the year 1600, Europe was full of strange little places like this. Places where the church bell rang, even if nobody pulled the rope and people didn't ask too many questions after dark. The houses were low and slouched, like they'd given up standing straight, and the people inside them weren't much better. Life was hard and short and full of bad bread and worse luck. That year the barley died in the ground, a baby turned purple and stopped breathing, and the local cows started giving milk that tasted like iron. So naturally someone had to be blamed. That someone was Ellsworth. She wasn't like the other women. She lived alone in a moss-covered cottage near the woods, where the mushrooms grew in perfect circles, and the crows sat in rows like they were waiting for a show. Ellsworth wasn't young or old, pretty or plain. She was just Ellsworth. She knew which herbs stopped a fever and which ones made your neighbour's dog throw up. And she made tea that fixed your stomach but tasted like death itself. The villagers tolerated her because she helped with births and stitched up wounds, but they also kept one eye on her door and never let their kids go too close. She had a black cat named Grim who followed her everywhere and sat like a statue outside her window. If that wasn't suspicious enough, she also spoke Latin when she was annoyed, laughed at funerals and didn't go to church unless there was free bread. She wasn't evil, just different. And in 1600, different got you killed. It started with whispers. Whispers have sharp teeth, especially in villages with more chickens than books. She looked at my husband and now he's got the shakes. My goat died after she walked past it. I saw her boiling something green in a pot. It didn't take long for the rumours to stick. After all, when things go wrong and you can't explain it, a witch is the easiest answer. And Ellsworth? She didn't help her case. When the village priest showed up to check on her soul, she offered him mushroom tea and asked if he'd ever considered that God might be a woman. That conversation went exactly how you'd expect. Soon after, the magistrate came, wearing a wig that looked like it had been attacked by a bird, and carrying a scroll he pretended to know how to read. He said someone had reported Ellsworth for unnatural behaviour. When she asked what that meant, he muttered something about moon watching and root whispering. Ellsworth blinked and said, "So I'm getting arrested for gardening at night?" But sarcasm was another red flag. They didn't arrest her yet, though. First, they needed more proof, which meant asking her neighbours questions that only had one right answer. Like, have you seen her talking to animals? Yes. Does she own an unusual number of spoons? Maybe. Has she ever made you feel uncomfortable for reasons you can't explain? Absolutely. Things snowballed fast. By the end of the week, the local butcher swore her shadow moved even when she stood still, and 3 kids claimed her cat talked in their dreams. The final nail came when the baker's wife accused Ellsworth of causing her to miscarry with a curse bread, which is wild because everyone knew the baker's wife couldn't bake for her life, and her bread had been killing people long before Ellsworth came along. But truth didn't matter. Fear did. And once fear takes the wheel, logic gets thrown out the cart. One grey morning, with fog so thick it looked like the forest was trying to smother the village, Ellsworth heard knocking at her door. She opened it to find the priest, the magistrate, and 2 bored-looking guards. The priest had a cross, the magistrate had that same bird nest wig, and the guards had rope. "Ellsworth," the priest said, trying to sound holy but mostly sounding cold, "you are accused of witchcraft, consorting with the devil, and bringing ruin upon this village." Ellsworth looked at them for a long moment, then at her cat, who yawned. "You're blaming me for your bad weather and dead pigs?" she asked. No one answered. She stepped aside without a fight. "Fine," she said, "but someone better water my plants while I'm gone." And just like that, she was taken, not with screams or fire, yet, but with silence and the slow creak of the village turning its back. No one protested, no one cried out, not even the people she'd healed. That's how it went back then. One moment you're making tea, the next you're a monster. In a place where the devil was more real than disease, and women who didn't smile enough were suspicious. It didn't take much. Just a bad season. A dying child, a few. Too many herbs. And maybe a black cat who blinked too slowly. Ellsworth didn't beg. She knew how this ended. She'd seen it before. Heard the stories passed in hushed voices by candlelight. Witches weren't burned for what they did. They were burned for what they reminded people of. That the world was cruel. That some people lived outside the rules. And that not everything could be prayed away. As the village door shut behind her, and Grim sat alone in the mist, tail twitching, it was already decided. The trial hadn't even started. But the fire was coming, and everyone knew it. The witchfinder showed up 3 days later, riding a pale horse like some kind of budget apocalypse, and looking like he hadn't smiled since birth. His name was Oswald Creel, though everyone just called him the Witch Man, in that wary way you talk about a thunderstorm heading toward your roof. He wore a long black coat, pointy boots, and a tall hat that made him look like he was constantly judging you from above. He also carried a leather-bound book, a bag of strange tools, and the type of confidence only people with zero doubt and too much free time possess. The village lined up to meet him like he was royalty, though what they'd actually summoned was closer to an exterminator with Bible verses. Oswald had done this before, many times. He claimed to be blessed with a special eye for the devil's work. But most of that eye's focus was on women who owned books, liked solitude, or asked too many questions. Within an hour of arriving, he'd inspected Ellsworth's abandoned cottage and declared her guilty of 5 sins, 7 curses, and at least 1 suspicion of night dancing. He also kicked her cat, which promptly scratched his boot, and somehow this was added to the list of offences. Down in the stone cell beneath the church, damp, cold, and smelling like mildew and regret, Ellsworth sat on a straw mat with her hands tied, listening to the muffled noises above. Creel visited her that night, flanked by guards, his nose wrinkled like he could already smell sulphur. "You may confess now and save your soul," he said, holding out a cross like it was a fly swatter. Ellsworth stared at it, then at him and said, "Confess to what?" "Making decent soup." Creel didn't laugh. He wasn't the laughing type. He pulled a chair across the floor and launched into a monologue about darkness, temptation, and how the devil often entered through a woman's left eye. Ellsworth listened politely, then asked if he was single. That earned her 3 days without sleep. Creel had methods, and they weren't subtle. He kept the cell cold, lit no candles, and made the guards ask her questions through the night. Did she dream of flying? Did animals obey her? Had she ever danced under the moon? Had she ever eaten cake on a Sunday? Every answer she gave was somehow wrong. If she said no, she was defiant. If she said yes, she was guilty. Even silence was suspicious. They searched her body for a witch's mark, which meant stripping her and pointing at every mole and scar like they were clues in some divine murder mystery. She bore it with quiet fury. The worst part wasn't the humiliation. It was knowing the villagers she'd helped were the same ones standing in the crowd, nodding, whispering, watching. Outside the prison walls, Oswald Creel turned the whole thing into theatre. He held daily gatherings in the church square, reading passages from his book, and warning of evil growing just beyond the hedge. He talked about Ellsworth like she was a storm they'd barely survived. The townsfolk nodded solemnly, some clutching their children, others throwing sidelong glances at neighbours who might be next. That's how panic spreads, not with screams but with quiet agreement. Creel didn't need facts. He had stories. He told them about other towns, other witches, other flames, about goats born with 2 heads and boys who spoke in Latin after eating strange berries. Each tale blurred the line between folklore and fear, until the villagers weren't sure if they remembered things happening or just imagined them hard enough to believe it. And it worked. Every day brought a new accusation. A girl said Ellsworth once looked at her during a thunderstorm. A man said his back started hurting the day after she walked past his porch. Someone claimed she turned their beer sour by thinking at it too hard. Creel wrote it all down with a quill and a smirk. He even had a checklist. Knows plants, doesn't marry, talks to birds, owns a mirror, laughs during rain. Ellsworth ticked nearly all of them. One evening, he brought her a feather and told her to weigh it against her soul. When she didn't answer, he said the silence was proof of guilt. "Is breathing still allowed?" she asked. He frowned and wrote something in his book. That night she dreamed of fire. Not because she feared it, but because it felt inevitable. This wasn't about what she'd done. It was about control, fear, blame. The village needed something to burn so they could feel clean again. And Oswald Creel, he was just the match. He didn't hate Ellsworth. He didn't even know her. To him, she was a job, a story he'd already written the ending to before he even arrived. All that was left was to act it out, one grim step at a time. By the end of the week, the verdict was ready. There was no trial, not really, just a formal reading of what everyone already believed. She was guilty of witchcraft, her soul was condemned, and the punishment was purification by fire. The priest said it would cleanse her. The magistrate said it would protect the town. Creel said nothing, just nodded like someone who'd done this all before and would do it again. As Elsbeth sat in her cell, staring at the crack in the wall that looked vaguely like a cat, the guards came in with ropes. She stood up without a word. They tied her hands gently, like they were afraid she'd curse them if it hurt. Outside, the villagers gathered, holding torches and children, both flickering in the wind. And just like that, the next chapter began. Not with fire, but with footsteps echoing down a stone corridor, steady and slow, leading a woman to a death that had already been decided. The sky was the kind of grey that made everything feel like a funeral, even before the fire started, and the air carried that strange nervous energy that only comes when a crowd is pretending not to be excited. It was execution day, and the village square was packed. People had come from nearby farms, dragging kids in itchy clothes and carrying baskets of boiled eggs and flatbread like they were headed to a fair. Vendors sold warm cider and dried apples. A man even played a lute, though it was wildly out of tune. That's the thing about a burning. People said it was about justice or cleansing or protecting the town from evil, but it always felt like theatre. And Elsbeth, she was the star of the show. She was led into the square just after midday, her hands bound, her feet bare, her dress the same one she'd worn during her arrest. Earth-coloured and plain, now stained with dirt and days in the cell. Her hair was loose, wild from sleep and stress, and Grim the cat was nowhere in sight. She didn't cry, didn't struggle. She just looked around slowly, her gaze brushing across faces she used to know, now full of something between pity and fear. The priest walked beside her, reciting verses like he was trying to chase the devil out of the wind. He told her to repent, but she didn't reply. At the centre of the square stood the stake, wrapped in thick rope and surrounded by a ring of firewood, stacked so neatly it looked like someone had practiced. The magistrate stood nearby, dressed in ceremonial red, with a scroll in his hand, and the expression of someone who thought he was doing something noble. And Oswald Creel, the witchfinder, stood near the back, arms crossed, eyes sharp, mouth set in a line that said this was all routine. The villagers watched as Elsbeth was tied to the stake, her arms pulled behind her, the rope rough against her skin, her ankles fixed tight to the base. She looked up, not at the heavens, but at the birds circling overhead. Then she closed her eyes. The priest stepped forward and began the final rites, declaring that Elsbeth's soul would be cleansed by fire, and that by the mercy of the church, her death would serve as a warning to those who walked the path of darkness. It was said with such drama that a few people in the back clapped, until they realised clapping at an execution wasn't quite the look. The wood was soaked with something flammable. It smelled sweet and wrong. Creel gave a nod, and a young man, barely old enough to grow a beard, stepped forward with a torch. He hesitated, looking at Elsbeth like he expected her to scream, beg, turn into a bat. Anything. But she didn't move. So he lit the kindling. The fire caught slow, curling around the bottom layer of branches like it was testing the air, then burst upward in hungry waves. Smoke bloomed into the sky, black and thick, while the flames turned orange and angry. Elsbeth didn't scream. Not once. Some said later that it was because she was brave. Others said she was casting a final curse, saving her breath for the afterlife. One woman swore Elsbeth smiled, but the truth is, no one really knows. Everyone watched, but no one saw the same thing. Some covered their eyes, others stared without blinking. A few wept. Children clung to parents. A couple merchants quietly packed their goods and slipped away. The priest kept reading, voice trembling, as if the fire was louder than the gospel. And through it all, Elsbeth remained still, wrapped in flame, framed by a village that had decided fear was easier than forgiveness. By the time the fire began to die, the crowd had already started to drift. People didn't stay long after the smoke thickened. There was nothing noble in the smell of burning skin. It clung to clothes and hair, and it was hard to pretend purity smelled like that. Creel was the last to leave, standing by the ashes like he was waiting for a sign. He poked the remains with a stick, found nothing but bones and dust, and finally turned away, coat flapping behind him like a shadow. Ellsworth was gone. Officially, her soul had been saved. Unofficially, she'd been erased. They buried what was left in an unmarked grave outside the village wall. No cross, no name, just a patch of disturbed soil and silence. The next Sunday, the priest gave a sermon about victory over evil. He used words like courage, righteousness, and divine order. The villagers nodded along, still coughing from smoke that hadn't quite cleared. No one mentioned Ellsworth, not directly, but there was something strange in the air, a kind of unease that didn't leave. The baby who cried every night still cried. The cows still gave bad milk. The barley still failed to grow. And though no one said it out loud, a few began to wonder if maybe they hadn't fixed the problem at all. Maybe they'd just made it worse. That's the trouble with fear. It doesn't vanish with fire. It lingers, curls into cracks, waits. And sometimes it whispers a name, long after the body is gone. The fire was out, the ashes cold, but the village didn't quite go back to normal. Not really. There was something heavy in the air, something that made the birds quieter and the dogs restless. The square still smelled faintly of smoke, no matter how much it rained. People avoided looking at the blackened stake still rooted in the ground, and the priest, who once shouted sermons with thunder in his voice, now mumbled them, like he wasn't sure who was listening. For a few weeks there was talk of peace, of how the village had been saved, how the devil had been cast out. But behind closed doors, people whispered that the bad luck hadn't stopped. The butcher's boy fell sick with fever. A cartwheel snapped for no reason, flinging a man into a ditch. A goat gave birth to something that didn't look quite right. And through it all, no one said her name. Not Ellsworth. Not the witch. Not even her. She became a shadow that walked behind the villagers, quiet and unseen, reminding them that the fire hadn't fixed anything. Oswald Creel left soon after the burning, of course. That's what men like him did. He packed his book and his hat and rode off to the next village, where fear still had teeth and people still believed you could burn your problems away. He never looked back. He didn't need to. He'd seen enough smoke to know what it meant. The villagers were left with silence and guilt, though most wouldn't have called it that. They said prayers a little louder. They made the sign of the cross twice instead of once. They clutched their children tighter at night. But they still looked at the woods like something was watching. They still jumped when the church bell rang wrong. Some of them swore they saw Grim the cat at the edge of the forest, eyes glowing like coals. Others said he was just a stray now, a creature with no home, no mistress, and no reason to trust. A few left offerings at the spot where the ashes had been swept away. Flowers, bread, once even a silver ring. No one admitted to doing it, but the items always vanished overnight. It was as if the village wanted to apologise, but didn't know how. Across Europe, the witch hunts continued. Ellsworth's story was just one of thousands. Women dragged from beds, accused by neighbours, tortured until they confessed to impossible things, then burned, drowned or hanged in the name of salvation. Some historians say it was fear of change. Others say it was the plague, the wars, the endless hunger. But maybe it was just a time when the world didn't know who to blame. So it blamed women who were alone, clever, or inconvenient. By the mid-1600s, the trials began to slow. People started asking questions about evidence, about justice, about whether witches were real or just made up to explain things no one understood. The fires still burned for a while, but the crowds got quieter. The witch-finders found fewer jobs. And slowly the world started to change. Not all at once, not with a bang, but with doubt creeping in like fog. People began to wonder, what if we were wrong? What if those women weren't witches? What if we just needed someone to blame when our crops failed, and our babies cried and our gods stayed silent? Ellsworth didn't live to see that change, but her story echoes like so many others. Not written in books or carved in stone, but passed in whispers, in legends, in the nervous glances villagers give to women who walk alone in the woods. Some say she was the last real witch, Some say she cursed the village before she died, but most say nothing at all, because stories like hers make people uncomfortable. They remind us that the line between justice and cruelty is thin, and that sometimes the loudest voices belong to the most afraid. And that's the thing, really. Fear has always been the easiest kind of power. It spreads fast, it burns bright. It makes ordinary people do terrible things in the name of safety. And long after the fire goes out, the fear stays, like smoke in the sky. As for Ellsworth, maybe she was just a woman with a cat, a teapot, and too much knowledge for her time. Or maybe, in some small way, she became what they accused her of, a spirit that lingers, a name that can't be erased. Not by fire, not by silence, just ash, and memory, and the quiet truth that the worst monsters aren't always the ones hiding in the woods. Sometimes they're the ones lighting the torches. If you enjoyed this story, give it a like and subscribe for more strange and dark tales from history. Sleep tight, and try not to get accused of witchcraft.